unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. Over the last decade, election campaigns in India have undergone a dramatic shift. Political parties increasingly rely on political consulting firms, tech-savvy volunteers, data-driven pollsters, and online battles to mobilize voters. But what exactly is driving these fundamental changes to electioneering? The Backstage of Democracy, India's Election Campaigns, and the People Who Manage Them is a new book by the scholar Amogh Dhar Sharma, which tries to locate answers to this question. The book takes readers behind the scenes where they're introduced to BJP IT cell workers, campaign consultants, data strategists, and political bosses. Amogh is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. His research explores the interface between politics and technology, political communication, and histories of science and technology. Amogh joins me from India today to talk more about the book. Amogh, congrats on the book and nice to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Milan. Really glad to be on the show. I'm a long-term listener of Grand Tamasha.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. I have heard, as I was saying before we hit the record button, a lot about your work, which is not only incredibly timely, given the dramatic shifts we're seeing in campaigning in India, but also I think kind of theoretically quite meaty and interesting. And I want to try and take listeners through so both of those aspects, the kind of, conceptual contributions of your book as well as the empirical ones. Let's start in a more kind of mundane space, which is with the origins of this book. In the preface, you note that this book drew upon, a decade-long research project. You began first as a graduate student, later as a postdoctoral researcher at Oxford. Specifically, your interest in this subject first took root in the summer of 2013 as the campaign for the 2014 general elections was kind of gaining momentum. Take us back, more than a decade now to that moment. Tell us why and how it left an impression on you.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe that's been more than a decade. Sometimes it seems like it all happened yesterday. So yes, the book is based on my doctoral dissertation, which was finished at Oxford. And the doctoral dissertation itself was based from a very humble master's thesis. And I started my MPhil at Oxford in October 2013. But during the summer months, right before I started my degree, I, like so many others, were already fascinated by this campaign that was already underway for the 2014 general election. In the summer of 2013, Narendra Modi was first made the chairman of the campaign coordination committee for the BJP. Then in September, he was declared as BJP's prime ministerial figure. And from there on, we saw those 3D hologram rallies, Chai Pe Charcha, and some of the most spectacular forms of campaigning. And also we saw a man called Prashant Kishore, who we will no doubt come to in a second. And what we were really witnessing was a new grammar of politics and how campaigns were being conducted. So, as a master's student, when one has to write and come up with a topic for a master's dissertation, I was sort of fascinated and I wanted to study this new era of campaigning. I think around that time, I should also say that I was also, through my graduate work, I was also coming across certain scholars, such as Arvind Rajagopal, his book, Politics After Television, which looks at the rise of Ram Janmabhoomi movement and the role that media played in that period. Or scholars such as David Ludden, Sandhya Freitag, who looked at forms of Hindu nationalist or proto-Hindu nationalist mobilizations in late colonial India. So I thought here was really an opportunity to study the second coming of BJP from a media angle. And then, of course, I did fieldwork for my master's dissertation in the summer of 2014 after the results had been declared. And I remember going to the IT cell at 11 Ashoka Road, which is the BJP headquarters before it's changed its address recently, or even to the RSS headquarters in Jhandewala in New Delhi. And I was really struck by two things when I was doing that project, which was really looking quite narrowly at the role of social media in Indian politics. And I remember being struck by two things. The first was that in the BJP, I saw this IT cell, this domain, this enclave, which is cut off from the rest of the party headquarters. And nothing that I'd read in India's intra-party politics, the scholarship on that, had really prepared me to witness such an organizational setup. And the second thing I remember being quite fascinated by is that I was hoping to find people who were running the IT cell. And you would remember that up until that point, there was this trope in the press, but also in everyday conversation, that the IT cell was being run by this sort of lumpenized urban youth who was being paid 10 rupees for every tweet that they were making. But actually what I saw in the IT cell in the BJP was that actually these were really well-educated folks who had left jobs, well-paying jobs in the private sector to come and do party work for the BJP. So it was both these observations that really intimated me to the fact that, this was not simply a story of social media. Something much deeper was changing. And I think that is what then became the PhD and then has become the book. A new grammar, a new way of doing politics altogether, of which social media is really only the tip of the iceberg.
And I think, just to take our listeners back, it has been a while. Some of our listeners may not have been paying attention or we got old enough, really. But, when you go back and you look at that period between Narendra Modi's re-election, his final campaign in Gujarat in December of 2012, and the Lok Sabha elections in May, June 2014, there was a almost unparalleled saturation of the political space by Modi and the BJP campaign that saw so many innovations, right? Whether it was social media, whether it was technology, whether it was hologram-driven events. It felt like that India had crossed some kind of Rubicon into this new space. I want to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of your argument in the book. And, the one of the big concepts that you introduce to the readers is this idea of the professionalization of politics. And what you mean by that is essentially a shorthand for, I think, two tectonic changes in Indian politics, or politics more generally, right? The first is the rise of digital technology in campaigning. And the second is a reliance on outside experts or campaign consultants. Now, these are developments which are hardly unique to India, right? We've seen both in spades in the American, kind of political firmament for a long time now. But you write that, look, it's a mistake to conflate the professionalization of Indian politics as a process of either Americanization or modernization. Unpack that for us.
Sure. So when I started this project, I was looking for the right term which would encapsulate all of these different changes that I was focusing on. And Americanization is a very popular term that exists both in everyday conversation, but also in the academic literature. So I should say that, a lot of people say Americanization of politics is almost like a pejorative term that, somehow uncouth or really flashy forms of politics has entered the domain. That's not the sense in which I will use it. But let's take seriously for a second scholars who have argued that there is such thing as Americanization of election campaigning, which has then swept other parts of the world. Now, there are really two ways in which this idea of Americanization or modernization really comes to the fore. There is one theory which says that what we see in the American presidential forms of campaigning is simply a process of modernization. This is a theoretical approach that really that became popular in the 1990s when the older certitudes of modernization theory were being resurrected after the end of the Cold War. And the idea was that as different countries around the world acquire something such as modernity, however one might define that, we will see a convergence in styles of political communication and campaigning. Now, I don't subscribe to that modernization theory view, so it's hard for me to begin with the premise which says that politics somehow proceeds first in the West, then in the rest sort of a way. And I think that sort of a view is well buried for good reason. But there is, of course, a second way in which Americanization can be taken seriously, which is the idea that there is something to be said about the fact that cultural practices which emerge from the field of communication or campaigning, these are cultural diffusion which happens in other parts of the world. So this is an industry of campaign professionals that is learning from best practices from around the world. So they're imitating, they're adapting, and they're borrowing techniques from what has been seen in the case of US politics. Now, I do find this to be slightly sympathetic. A lot of the political consultants, for instance, that I've done research with are quite fascinated by, let's say, a figure such as David Axelrod, who was Obama's chief strategist. Or, when I was doing fieldwork in 2017, they were obsessed with this documentary on Netflix, which was Get Me Roger Stone, or Call Me Roger Stone, I forget the exact title, right? So there's this fascination with how campaigning is done in the US, and let's try and replicate that. A lot of the folks who I talk about in the book, they were often studying or working in the US, and they were clearly learning some of which they practiced when they came back to India. So there is a bit of cultural adaptation, but the problem that I have with the term Americanization is twofold. The first is that it does not really take into account that the cultural imitation and the cultural diffusion of ideas is actually bidirectional. It's not simply that India is borrowing stuff from the US, but equally, I think this is a global industry. Actually, back in January, just in this year, one of the biggest conferences on political consultants actually took place not in a developed country, but actually took place in Cape Town, right? So it really tells you that the global industry of campaign professionalization, the center of gravity has actually shifted to the global south. I'm also really fascinated by the fact that when I've done follow-up interviews with a lot of people who I've known for close to a decade in this field of political consulting in India, a lot of them have told me that they are getting clients from outside India to come and share their expertise. And I think that is fascinating. And I think the second reason why I find the modernization perspective or the Americanization thesis so unreliable is that when it comes to certain technologies, I feel like we've seen them being used for campaigning and political communication far more extensively in developing countries such as India than in the developed world. So last year, 2024 was the big year of elections around the world. I think it was fascinating that the whole conversation about deepfakes or AI generated content was so much more prominent in countries such as India or Indonesia than it was, let's say, in the US or the UK. So I think for those reasons, I think there is something to be said about the fact that consultants in India or elsewhere are borrowing techniques from their US counterparts. But I think Americanization just does not capture the global nature of this industry, and the fact that there is a borrowing and adaptation, it's bidirectional. It's not a one-way traffic of ideas or practices.
When it comes to what gives rise to professionalization in politics, you dwell at some length on both what you call demand and supply side factors, right? So if you look at the demand side, you talk about the contributions of technological innovation, kind of the feeling of crisis within, party organizations, partisan de-alignment, the composition of political leadership, party finance, regulation. But you say it's really on the supply side, which where scholars have not paid sufficient attention, right? So if you just take that bit for a moment, when it comes to India, what is the major supply side explanation at work in your view for why we are seeing this professionalization grow over time?
Sure. I must confess that, my first degree was in economics and I came to political science much later. So, this whole demand side view and this sort of a demand side versus supply side approach of understanding professionalization, I think is the old economist in me rearing its head. Right. So as you said, to understand the rise of campaign professionalization, I think we need to focus on both why parties and politicians demand the services of these campaign professionals, and that is the demand side explanation. But also there is a supply side question, which is to ask that why are certain individuals interested in becoming campaign professionals, right? There's nothing inherent in the fact that if parties and politicians are demanding certain services, that people will simply, rise up and provide these services immediately. And I think when I look back in the evolution of this project, I think it wasn't simply the fact that these changes were happening in Indian politics that I wanted to explain, but it was the particular timing that I think fascinated me so much. So for instance, if the idea is that there is a crisis in the party organization, which explains why parties have demanded the services of campaign professionalization, one needs to explain the fact that parties in India have been in an organizational crisis for decades now. Why is it that 2014 is really the big bang moment when political consultants come to the fore? And I think this is here where the supply side factor really comes into the picture and really helps us provide and put our finger on the timing of professionalization of Indian politics. So I argue that in the Indian case, the supply side question, the question about why people are interested in becoming campaign professionals, can be understood if we take seriously the political culture of the people, right? So in the book, I proceed in a two-step fashion. First, I try to understand what is the socio-demographic profile of the people who work in this industry, right? What ranks do they come from in terms of their sociological composition? And second bit I want to ask is that what is their motivation? What were they doing before they became campaign professionals? What made them make this switch from their existing professions to what they move towards? And the first part of the answer is that people who have occupied the top reins in this industry come from what I call the new middle class in India. This is the sociological group which has benefited the most from India's liberalization from the 90s onwards. And the second part of my answer is that the supply side factor is the fact that there is something peculiar in the political culture of India's new middle class that has shaped their proclivities to become a campaign professional. In particular, I would argue that because the new middle class in India sees existing channels of political participation to be broken, they see it as too criminal, too corrupt, to beholden to money and muscle power, which is why campaign professionalization has become a new way of engaging with politics. So that, in a nutshell, for me, is the supply side part of the answer.
So I want to just pause on that, the second bit of the explanation, right? Because I was really struck in reading your book by the extent to which the professionalization of politics, as you see it, is so deeply, inextricably intertwined with the emergence of broader middle class in India. And in the book, you say, look, many middle-class citizens, they have this fear or this apprehension about electoral and party politics, right? Where it's a questionable, perhaps slightly dirty or sordid sort of affair, but professionalization offers them a way out, right? So how does it offer them a way out?
So I think the biggest way in which it offers them a way out is one, the question of speed, and second is the question of skill. Right. So if you're a regular Karyakarta who joins the Congress party of the BJP, you really have to slog it out for many years before you can perhaps hope to get a Zilla Parishad ticket. So if you're really starting out through the route of, let's say, agitational politics, or let's say if you had your entry into party politics through, let's say, contesting a student union elections, the kind of resources that you need to marshal are, let's say, you need to perhaps have the right caste profile, which might predispose the party high command to giving you or nominating you through the ranks of the party machinery. Or let's say you're a political dynast, in which case you know the right person, and again, you have a greater proclivity to get a party ticket. Or let's say you can command great financial wealth, which of course, Milan, you have written so wonderfully about, and Nilanjan Sarkar also has written so much about. So there is an existing idea that in terms of the skill that you need to have the right muscle power, the right caste profile, and you need to produce and perform a certain sort of agitational politics. And the new middle class folks who were really my interlocutors during fieldwork were completely felt that they did not possess any of these qualities. However, what they did possess was that they could speak the language of data and technology. And they were quite acutely aware of the fact that currently in Indian politics, Indian politicians did have a demand for their services and their skills. So what they were able to do was this sort of take a high-speed lane into the top echelon of party politics in India. And they were able to leverage their skills in data and technology and offer certain services and certain value addition, which then politicians could take them seriously, and hence they could create a foothold for themselves within party politics. So for them, that then becomes the route into party politics rather than the old agitational way of being a Karyakarta, of rising through the ranks of the party machinery.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendowment.org/NPC2025.
I want to kind of delve into the kind of evolution here and give our listeners some of the context that you bring out from the kind of Indian political domain. You cite the scholar Angelo Panebianco, who has this distinction between two things: a mass bureaucratic party, which accords a central role to party bureaucrats, and what he calls an electoral professional party, where party employees occupy a central role. And in terms of India's transition from the former to the latter, you see the Rajiv Gandhi era of the kind of mid to late 1980s as being a kind of important inflection point. Tell us why.
Absolutely. So, to my mind, in some ways, the Indian National Congress in the first 2 decades after independence is the most quintessential example of what Angelo Panebianco called the mass bureaucratic party. So we know, of course, that from the late colonial period into the period of independence, Congress is this vast machinery that has deep roots in different parts of the country. It has this extensive organizational structure with Pradesh-level committees, district-level committees, mandal-level committees, and at each level you have organizational officers who are providing and performing key tasks for the party. And again, we don't need to fetishize it or glamorize it, because that party model had its own problems. But what is undeniable is that this was an extensive and well-oiled organizational machinery. Now, of course, we know from the existing scholarship that in 1969, Indira Gandhi splits the party, and from there on, the Congress party undergoes a period of deinstitutionalization. And so the situation that the party finds itself in the early 80s is that Indira Gandhi, when she comes back to power in 1980, she's literally handpicking Congress chief ministers and solving all problems in the party organization through her individual charisma. And when Rajiv really enters this picture after the death of his brother Sanjay Gandhi, what he inherits is this really extremely deinstitutionalized party structure, which he has grand ambitions of reviving. And his response and his grand plan of reviving the party sort of takes the party in the direction of what can be called as the electoral professional party. And it takes the route of an electoral professional party because his solution is not to introduce the modicum of intra-party democracy that, let's say, existed in the 50s and 60s, even though, there was problems with bogus membership and all of that. But his approach is not to turn the clocks back and turn the Congress party into what it existed in the 50s and 60s, but actually to erect parallel structures. So we see this quite clearly in the early 80s, when he's still the general secretary of the party, that he creates this really ambitious program of something called the Youth Coordinators, that is launched through the Indian Youth Congress, in which he wants to recruit well-educated, well-qualified people who often have extensive experience of working in the private sector as the new foot soldiers of the Congress party, who will tour all over the country and report back to him and send him vast amounts of data about what's happening around the country. And from there on, we also see this tendency, which continues till this date, about data fetishism and the introduction of computers to manage everyday decision-making. And that was really a funny period in Indian politics, because there was this belief that this computer that had been acquired by the Congress party would bring Congress party out of its doldrums, right? So this computer, which is affectionately called Computer G back in the day, could spit out the most winnable candidates who should be nominated for election, could tell which are the best swing constituencies where Rajiv should conduct a rally for a general election campaign. And it could also become this virtual panopticon, which would provide Rajiv Gandhi with an eye on all his MPs and MLAs at all points of time. So this sort of technological fetishism really takes root in this period. And what's leading this technological fetishism is also personnel who speak the language of data and technology, which of course was far more limited back then in the 80s than it is now, or even now, I should say. So it's really in the Rajiv Gandhi years that I think culturally, materially, organizationally set the wheels in motion to the trend that we really see concretizing and has concretized in front of our eyes today. It's an ideological approach where you're thinking about politics in a certain way, where you're thinking that the solution to politics is data and technology and not really organizational revival, which is why I think in some ways the story does start in the 80s for us.
I want to just contrast the Congress story with the BJP story. I mean, it was fascinating to kind of go back and think about the kind of dual evolution, right? Given how savvy the BJP is today in 2025 when it comes to technology, campaign, experts and so on and so forth, it's really noteworthy that if you go back a couple decades to the early 1980s, I mean, you write that, look, the BJP was in many ways the least likely candidate to proceed on a path of professionalization. I think it'd be useful to hear from you on kind of what was the BJP's view back then, and when and how did it change?
Yeah, you're quite right, Milan. I mean, this was the biggest surprise to me too. And I should share the fact that, this whole Rajiv side of the story actually was not known to me. And the reason I found out about it is that quite randomly one day when I was doing a bit of archival research at the Teen Murthy Library, which is now the Prime Minister Memorial Library in Delhi, I was going through the back issues of the organizer, which is the mouthpiece of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. And I was just flipping randomly through some random issues of the organizer from the 80s. And I see this paranoia that appears in issue after issue, where they're sort of launching these jibes at the Congress computer boys, the computer caucus, and they have these really funny and really badly done caricatures of Rajiv Gandhi holding a computer and giving it to a poor man, which I reproduce in the book. So it's really reading the organization that alerted me the fact that it's actually Rajiv who's doing something quite innovative in this period in the Congress party. So right, there was something in, I think, the Hindu nationalist worldview, which of course seeped the BJP in the 1980s, that predisposed it to not rely on political marketing. So at the moment when Rajiv Gandhi was introducing, let's say, his big plans of data fetishism and introducing the computer for political decision-making, or let's say bringing on board a private company to run a political campaign in the newspapers, the BJP was extremely reluctant to do all of this. And I think the reason for this is because of a couple of reasons. The first is, I think, Hindu nationalists as an ideological movement is quite unwilling to look at and accept short-term routes to success, right? This is an organization that prides itself of long-term activism, about character building, and it also has an aversion to what it calls Vyakti Pujan, right? Worshipping individuals. And from the very early years, we see that the prominent ideologues of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh quite believe that the organization should not turn to media forms of activism, and it should focus on long-term activism at the grassroots, which will help build character, which will help ensure ideological purity, and it will not lead to the Vyakti Pujan, which was such an anathema to the Hindu nationalists. And I think by the time we reach the 80s, even though the RSS and the BJP have sort of started issuing the organizer, and they're running a few newsletters and certain sympathetic newspapers around the country, on the whole, they're quite hostile to the idea that we need to wake up and enter this age of political marketing. And the story for me really changes of the 1984 general election campaign, in which the BJP only gets 2 seats, if I remember correctly. And following the defeat in the 1984 general election, the BJP really sets up this high-powered committee, which tries to diagnose why the party fared so badly. And one of the reasons that this high-powered committee, one of the answers that it comes up with, is that there was something about the fact that the Congress party had such a stranglehold on the media environment in the country. The Doordarshan, which was at that point still a complete state monopoly over broadcast, but also other forms of mass media. And it is this committee's approach and suggestion that going forward, the BJP should look at non-state controlled forms of media, and cassettes become a very strong part of that. One key member of this committee was someone who was really quite instrumental to my mind in BJP's route towards professionalization. And that man was the late Pramod Mahajan, who of course has his start as a humble Swayamsevak of the RSS, but of course rises through the ranks of the BJP, and to my mind becomes one of the most prominent people which has played a role in making BJP a more media-friendly party. So he played a very strong role during the Ram Janmabhoomi movement in ensuring the media side of things in the Rath Yatra that Advani launched. And even subsequently, as we go through the 90s, it's really Pramod Mahajan that sets up media cells within the political party and really makes BJP a far more media-friendly party.
I mean, he has this kind of mythical status almost within the BJP in India, right? I mean, he's sort of talked about in the same way that, some of our listeners might be familiar, might have heard of this American political campaign consultant, Lee Atwater, right, who was a celebrated strategist for the Republican Party. He advised both Reagan and George H.W. Bush. I think he was chairman of the Republican National Committee. He sort of famously pioneered these very aggressive kind of in-your-face tactics to try and reimagine the brand of the modern Republican Party and put the Democratic Party sort of on the back foot. I mean, Pramod Mahajan is not talked about so much anymore, but he really wasn't he, a kind of pivotal person in affecting this shift for the BJP?
Absolutely. I mean, as social scientists, we try not to dwell too much on counterfactuals because they're unknowns. But I think you're quite right. I think it's a big surprise that we don't think too much about Pramod Mahajan now, because he, of course, had an untimely death back in 2005 or 6, if I remember correctly. And I do think that, had he been alive, had he still been active in Indian politics, the face of the BJP would look quite different. I think I would go as far as saying that perhaps Prime Minister Modi might not be Prime Minister Modi. Maybe it would be Prime Minister Pramod Mahajan. And I'm not the only one who said that. Many journalists have made the point in recent years and even back then. And it's not simply media, right? So in the 1990s, one of the things that BJP becomes alive to is what Govindacharya called social engineering, which is the idea that BJP is seen as a Brahmin Banya party, and it needs to include far more OBCs within its ranks. And at that time, Pramod Mahajan is also leading this effort within the BJP of social profiling constituencies, right? So I find it so fascinating that 1990s is a moment where BJP success is supposedly on the basis of a singular Hindu community that is trying to unify, but actually behind the scenes, in the Backstage of Democracy, as the title of my book says, it's actually breaking up the Hindu community into its constituent parts, into its subcaste categories. And that, for me, is really the secret of BJP success in the 90s, that while it's riding the wave of Hindu consolidation, but people like Pramod Mahajan actually know that it's actually profiling and voter segmentation that is really the root for electoral success. And it's really a history that we've forgotten today.
I want to kind of take us to the present. And, speaking of kind of mythical entities, one of those mythical entities is the BJP IT cell, right? This, again, was a unit that prior to 2014, we never really thought about. It's now has this kind of larger than life persona. Amit Malviya, the leader of the BJP IT cell, is kind of well known, I think, to kind of, election analysts and followers. Certainly he appears frequently on Indian media, defending the BJP quite aggressively. You, at one point in the book, sketch out kind of what an average day looks like if you're a worker bee in the kind of BJP IT cell. And I wonder if you could just kind of walk us through, at a mundane level, how do they do their jobs, right? What does it actually look like from the inside out?
Sure. Let me perhaps just start with two quick caveats. The first of which is that perhaps it's possible to speak about multiple IT cells in the BJP. So there's certainly an IT cell that exists at the New Delhi headquarters, but I think the genius of the way BJP runs its IT cell, if I could use that word, is the fact that it's quite decentralized. So there is certainly a centralized office, but there are also regional level offices, and goes all the way down to booth level social media conveners. And I think that's part of how it functions on an everyday level. And the second thing worth saying is that, the way I've described it in the book is, of course, true of what I observed. I'm sure things have changed subsequently. So with those two caveats, I think the way it was described to me and the way I saw it being observed is that at the national headquarters, in the morning, you will begin by a meeting of the key figures who are the top level party employees in the IT cell. So you will look at perhaps if there's an election coming up, you will have talking points of the election, but out of normal day-to-day affairs, perhaps there's parliamentary proceedings that's going on. And they will already have a list of instructions from the organizational wing of the party about things that they need to highlight, certain agendas that they perhaps want to counter. And for this, a plan would be charted out. This would include both different platforms, YouTube or Twitter, what is now X, or Facebook. And of course, in recent years, WhatsApp and Telegram groups have also become quite prominent. So there'll be one wing creating content of it, and another wing within the IT cell that would be looking at how this might be disseminated through the different ranks. So the way the content would then be pushed would be it would move from the national headquarters to the state level units, going all the way down to the Karyakartas who have been appointed as the social media conveners of the BJP. But I think compared to other parties and their social media cells that I've seen operating, what I think was so well done in the BJP's case is that the information simply doesn't move from the top to the bottom, but equally it flows from the bottom up. So let's say if in some village in Uttar Pradesh, there's a certain scandal which has happened for which a local party worker feels that the party should publicize it, should bring it to the attention of national media, that story would then actually go up the chain of command. And I think that's something that other parties, when I look at the IT cells in comparative direction, in a comparative perspective, I think that's something that other parties have done far less successfully, that the information is not simply top down, it's also bottom up, the way it flows.
I mean, could you just tell us a little bit about what changes in the Modi era and in the kind of post 2014 divide? I mean, we tend to think of the elections of 2014, of 2019, of 2024 as breaking new ground in terms of social media technology, but you actually trace the mediatization, as you call it, of politics all the way back to 1990. What was sort of happening back then? What does the post-2014 era represent to you?
When I started this project, one of the things that I was not expecting that I would do was to look at the very first general election campaign in India, right? So I was never trained as a historian and never thought that history would play such a strong role in this book. But actually, I've had to do that. And the reason for that is that up until recently, we have had no sophisticated accounts of how political communication has evolved in India, right? I think it's still a shame that the story of India's first general election campaign is quite not well known, other than secondary reportage on that. So what I found interesting when I've looked at things in the historical long durée is that what has changed in India's general election campaigns is not the fact that we are suddenly using media and in the past we were not using it. From the very first election campaign in India, Congress was using documentary slides, gramophone records, literally every piece of media equipment that it could get its hands on. So in the book, I argue quite centrally that when I speak of mediatization, I'm not simply saying that politicians have woken up to the existence of a media artifact, which I think they've always been alive to that fact. But rather what we see in the 80s onwards is a certain media logic, which is to say that politicians become aware about the format of the media. And from the 2010s onwards, which is the era of professionalization, they also introduce a new type of advisors and personnel to manage that media. So going back to what we were discussing about earlier, in the 1980s and early 1990s, it was still Rajiv Gandhi in the Congress or a Pramod Mahajan in the BJP who were overseeing the media affairs. And what we see changing in the professionalization era is not some grand change in media technology, which of course has happened with the rise of social media, but also the nature of the advisors who are advising political parties, that has shifted. It is no longer an advisor which is cultivated on the basis of, let's say, long-term trust, or the fact that the person is an organizational man and understands the nuts and bolts of the party organization, but rather people who are given reins of power to manage the media side of an election campaign are people who are hired for their skill and for their expertise, irrespective of the fact whether they have party loyalty. And I think that's something dramatic that has changed in recent years.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I want to kind of talk about this figure of Prashant Kishore, right? I mean, one of the most enigmatic figures in Indian politics today. Most of our listeners will know about him, his former firm, IPAC, but I wonder if you could tell us about the role he's played in the professionalization of politics, and to what extent some of the big changes we're seeing in campaigns today could be traced to this one man. Because in a way, it's not really just about Prashant Kishore and his firm, but that has spawned a number of copycats, a number of wannabes, a number of people who have seen how this person and his colleagues have created a space that they have now tried to rush in and follow and fill in as well. Just give us a little bit, kind of a biographical sketch about who Prashant Kishore is and how he came to prominence.
Right. Enigmatic is really the right word for him, because I often like to joke that for everything that has been said about Prashant Kishore, the exact opposite has also been said. Just a few weeks back, I was at a friend's house party here in Delhi, and I met someone who actually worked in the organization which is called Citizens for Accountable Governance, which is the parent organization which splintered and led to the formation of IPAC. And this person, told me that actually, no, this thing that you think is true about Prashant Kishore is wrong, and let me tell you the right deal.
I should just say,
right?
CAG doesn't stand for Comptroller and Auditor General alone. It also stands for Citizens for Accountable Governance, which was a very important organization which helped to propel the BJP and Mr. Modi to power in 2014.
Absolutely. And it's also worth saying that I don't think it was a coincidence that the acronym of the organization was CAG. I think they knew what they were doing there. And I don't think I'm imputing malicious intentions. I think they were just generally smart guys. And they were guys, so I'm using that word advisedly. But going back to Prashant Kishore. So Prashant Kishore, whatever is known about that person, he was first a public health professional, worked in different parts of the world. It said parts of Africa, Chad. That's one version of the story that I've heard. And he really returns back to India sometime around 2009 to 2010. And there, of course, he writes a report on the state of malnutrition and public health in India, where he singles out Gujarat as a particularly poor performing state. It is said that through certain circumstances, this report comes to the attention of Chief Minister Modi, who's still, Narendra Modi is still the Chief Minister of Gujarat around then. And he brings Prashant Kishore on board to help with social welfare schemes and public policy sort of space in the Gujarat CMO. Now, the 2012 Gujarat elections was around the corner at that time. And at that time, one of Mr. Modi's close aides, Amit Shah, had been asked to stay away from Gujarat for certain legal disputes that he was involved in. And it is in this moment that Chief Minister Modi, now Prime Minister Modi, turned to Prashant Kishore to provide key inputs and key strategic inputs in his campaign for the 2012 Gujarat Assembly elections. And it's from there on that I think Prashant Kishore transitions from being the public health professional that he was into being this grand electoral strategist. It is said that around late 2012, early 2013, a group of young professionals, and this is within quotes, who were quite enamored by Chief Minister Modi, came together on over a coffee table discussion and got in touch with him, saying that they wanted to contribute something and make him the next prime ministerial figure. And it is said that Prime Minister Modi sort of brought them under Prashant Kishore's guidance, who then incorporated what became Citizens for Accountable Governance. And from there on, of course, we know that after the 2014 general election campaign, where CAG was doing some really spectacular things, including Chai Pe Charcha, those virtual 3D hologram rallies as well. It's after the 2014 general election that Prashant Kishore and Prime Minister Modi part ways for some reasons. And from there on...
Well, just the reasons are interesting, right? Which was that there, as it's told, Prashant Kishore was under the impression that he would be brought into government and leading a kind of powerful organization within the PMO to kind of carry out his work. And for one reason or another, that never ended up happening.
Absolutely, that is the reason. And I think he has sort of confirmed this. This was sort of whispered about for many years when I was doing fieldwork for this book, but in recent years he's come out and he's been asked about that, and he has confirmed that he did want this high-powered vehicle which would allow for lateral entry of professionals into the Indian bureaucracy, and he wanted this high-powered vehicle which would be in charge of social welfare schemes throughout India, and this could just not happen. And of course, people say that Amit Shah, rightly or wrongly, in some ways had a way of sort of closing that door. And it is after that a splinter group within what was earlier CAG comes together and runs themselves as IPAC, the Indian Political Action Committee. It needs to be said that PACs and super PACs have no legal recognition in Indian politics, but of course that says something about the cultural limitation point that we were discussing earlier. And Prashant Kishore and members of IPAC really decide to take up the 2015 Bihar Legislative Assembly elections as a test case where they're like, okay, we have won one general election campaign. Can we replicate the success in another election campaign? And there they start working with Nitish Kumar, the JDU, and what eventually becomes the Mahagathbandhan Alliance. And that is a spectacular success. Before it sort of all comes apart. But what's so of course...
And there's just to pause. I mean, this is like, it gave people like us cognitive dissonance because, of course, the JDU, Nitish Kumar, had been longtime allies of the BJP.
Yes.
There was a split. This was one of Nitish Kumar's many lives, right?
Many flip-flops that I've lost track of.
He joined hands with Lalu Prasad Yadav, the RJD, his sworn kind of enemy. I mean, these two were jockeying for political space. And Prashant Kishore comes in to run that campaign of foes turned friends against the BJP and Prime Minister Modi.
Absolutely. And, this is another feature about political consulting firms, which I think is not present in other parts of the world. So political consultants in the US, as per a recent survey, 90% of them were committed partisans, which is to say that 90% of them either work for different candidates within the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. They don't really cross party lines. Whereas I think what Prashant Kishore really inaugurated, which is I think why he's such an interesting figure to focus on in the book, is that he really inaugurates this trend where consultants in India are crossing party lines all the time, right? And it's shocking the extent to which they get away with it. So Prashant Kishore starts out with Prime Minister Modi and the BJP, switches to Nitish Kumar at a moment when JDU has broken off ties with the BJP, has gone and worked with TMC, Mamata Banerjee, has worked with Congress, Captain Amrinder Singh in Punjab, briefly also with Rahul Gandhi in UP, although that was a bit of a disaster, and just so many other examples like that. So yes, in the book, I do give a lot of emphasis and effort to describe Prashant Kishore's journey for a number of reasons. I think, one, he is a person who has made the industry of political consulting quite famous and has made it public. In the book, I actually show that the first political consultant in India was actually not Prashant Kishore. The first consultant can actually be traced all the way back to 2005. But the reason Kishore is so important is that he has made this term so familiar to voters in India. The second thing that I think makes him so important and worthy of focusing on is that he's not simply made it public, but he's also made political consulting almost an aspirational profession. right? There's almost a sexiness associated with it. When I've seen and interacted with members of IPAC, there is still such an enigma about how they think about Prashant Kishore. Many of them will tell you that, I've seen him sort of talk down to the senior bureaucrat or the senior politician. He doesn't take any nonsense from anyone. So there is this charisma that he's cultivated for himself and by extension for the industry, which is, I think, sort of marks him out. Equally, I'll add a quick point that I think in some ways he is, while he's the big person who is writ large and has left his impression on the industry, in some ways he's not entirely representative of the industry. And one way in which I think IPAC and Kishore are not representative is that hitherto their clients that they've had tend to be party-wide clients. So they work for the TMC as a whole in West Bengal, or they work for Congress and Captain Amrinder Singh across Punjab. Whereas most of the political consultants in India actually only get constituency-wide clients, right? So they'll, for instance, work in South Delhi for the Congress and in North Bombay for the BJP, and then will work in Kolkata for the TMC. So most of the consultants actually can't get these party-wide, statewide clients. They actually end up focusing on individual MLAs or individual MPs when they get clients.
We're in a bit of a weird election lull. It doesn't really happen that often in India, given the staggered nature of a state and national elections. We'll have Bihar elections coming back up October, November of this year. As you think about that election, just take an example, right? And you think about this growing professionalization, this class of political consultants, what are the types of things in, say, a Bihar election, irrespective of which party they're employed with? What are the types of things they're providing to the party bosses, right? What are the sorts of services, if you could kind of categorize them, that they're actually hired to take on?
So there are really two types of political consulting firms in India. One is the IPAC model, which we can call as the generalist, right? They offer what they like to call on their website 360-degree campaign management. So that will include everything from starting out with surveys, doing ground level reports and assessments, going and speaking to party workers, creating reports about what are the grievances in certain districts, certain parts of a province, collating them into a strategy based on the national headquarters in conversation with the party high command. Then, of course, they'll launch certain slogans, certain ad campaigns, which will then peter into the social media campaigns. This will go all the way into booth level management, which will include identifying key notables, let's say, associated in a particular village, identifying them running get out the vote campaigns on voting day. Equally, I should add that another well-kept secret within this domain of political consultants is also they're equally involved in offering gifts and bribes and alcohol and organizing feasts before election day, right? So that's not simply that's only being done by party workers. Consultants are actually sort of in the mix these days and organizing that. So that's a generalist model. But there is also another type of firm, which is a far more specialist, which won't do all of these firms within a single roof, which will only focus on certain aspects. So let's say they will be running a call center in which I saw this happen quite prominently in the 2022 Punjab election campaign. So let's say they'll run an IVR hotline in which they'll call up different voters and they'll say, if you want candidate A to be a chief ministerial candidate, press 1. If you want candidate B, press 2, so on and so forth. Another one will, let's say, offer a call center that calls up people and gets their opinion on a range of issues that they want to get interested in. Or there'll be a graphic design firm, right? So those will be far more specialized services that a specialist sort of a political consulting firm might deal with. So yes, there's all sorts of variations in what these consultants can offer parties.
So I want to kind of bring this back as maybe a way to kind of close this, Amogh, by linking this back to the kind of broader theoretical arguments you make in the book, right? One of the things you say in the concluding chapter is that, as you think about the long run, an association with a political consulting firm may actually strengthen rather than weaken the organizational capacity of a political party. And right, I mean, you could see in theory this going either way, right? I mean, if you bring in an external consultant, that could kind of hollow out the kind of muscle within the party. You're reliant on this kind of external agency. I'm thinking of kind of an analogy to kind of the foreign aid world, right? When you have a kind of parallel project implementation unit, you never actually build up the kind of line ministry. Or you could see this as essentially a force multiplier, which essentially helps helps to modernize, revolutionize, change the way the party functions. How do you think about the long-run interaction between these two forces?
Yeah, this was really a question that I was interested in from the start, that with the entry of political consultants or party employees, what is happening to political parties as entities? How are party workers cooperating or not with these consultants who sort of are parachuted in the areas where they've been working for years? Should we see them as allies, or are they adversaries where each party thinks that the other is sort of stepping on their toes? And initially, when I went into the field, I really thought it was the adversary view which would come to the fore, because there had been multiple accounts, let's say from the 2017 UP and Punjab election campaign, where IPAC was working with the Congress party. There were multiple news reports which said there was massive friction. Almost on a weekly basis, we would come across a news story saying that Prashant Kishore has left Captain Amrinder Singh's house in a huff and he's no longer speaking to Priyanka Gandhi or something or the other, right? This was really relentless. So I was really hoping to find a lot of friction. What I actually found when I was speaking both through IPAC employees as well as to party workers within the Congress was that there was this weird acceptance about the state of affairs. Sure, no one was entirely happy and they all wanted things to change here and there. But there was really a recognition that we were in a new landscape, both technologically, but also with the scale and sophistication of how modern campaigns are run. And they were willing to come to terms with the new division of labor with one another. So one of the things that I found quite interesting is that in UP, party workers were extremely grateful that finally IPAC employees had come to the mix, and they finally had a channel to make sure that the grievances reached the party high command. And they said that no one in years and decades had come to this particular district Congress committee office to find out what's been beleaguering us for all this while, right? So there were these channels of communication that suddenly opened up. People would vent and they would complain. And I'm not saying that they solved every problem under the sun, but there was a sense that was built up in those early weeks and early months that things might change, that things might happen, and there would be a real prospect of organizational and thus electoral revival. Equally, I was surprised to find that around 2016 and 17, when Congress was still struggling to make its social media presence felt, which is far better now, it has to be said, but around 2016 and 2017, IPAC's employees were helping district-level MLAs or district-level organizational units within the Congress to set up their social media profiles, get active on X, set up a booth-level WhatsApp group. Whether or not they've survived is, of course, an empirical question, and one would have to revisit the field to answer those things. But I was struck by the fact that there was such a thing as capacity building. And I think the analogy that you offered with foreign aid is an interesting one, where, again, I'm not saying that, we're only going up and beyond from this point on. I'm not making any of those predictions. But I think from what I did observe in the period when this industry was gaining roots within Indian politics, I did see that the situation wasn't as negative or toxic as one might have gleaned simply from newspaper reportage.
My guest on the show this week is the scholar Amogh Dhar Sharma. He is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Department of International Development at the University of Oxford and author of a brand new book called The Backstage of Democracy, India's Election Campaigns and the People Who Manage Them. Amogh, we were discussing before we hit the record button that, the best books I find are those books that are on a subject that are kind of staring you in the face. You know that they're there, but you never really stop to kind of problematize them. You sort of think you get it, and then you read a book like this and you're like, wow, this takes you into a world that you thought you knew. You had some priors about it. Some of those priors are right. Many of those priors are wrong. This is one of those books. I think it's going to be cited for a very, very long time for people who are trying to understand the huge changes underway and how campaigns take place, not just in India, but really this is part and parcel of a larger global story. Congratulations. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Kundan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.